How you guys doing today? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, here on a Thursday, January 9th, here. Not quite the start of the NFL week like we're typically used to, but I am geared up just because we do have a whole end of the week to weekend plan of just playoff football with the college football playoffs starting today. Obviously, very excited to watch that, and then the other semifinal tomorrow. Then we could start getting into the NFL playoffs. But with being so close to the weekend, I thought I'd start already previewing some of these games, considering there are 6 of them. So we're going to get to 5 over the course of today and tomorrow, and then I'll leave Monday Night Football for next week. So we're going to get into a couple previews today. Also, we're going to be rounding out some of the 49ers' latest moves. There's a couple of, off-season themed moves that they've already made, so I thought they were pretty interesting, and we're going to get to them, as well as a hypothetical scenario towards the end of the show as well. So make sure to stick around for that. But before we get started, a quick reminder to you guys, if you want to get involved with the show through a question, a comment, or just anything that's on your mind, any opinion you'd like to share, please don't hesitate to do so. Any input or insight that you have regarding any topic is always very much appreciated. We always like hearing what you guys have to say to take the conversation in a different direction potentially and just get your guys' perspective on anything that we're talking about, especially on these live shows. So if you want to make it absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on any of the live shows, there's an easy way to do that just by using the Super Chat feature. Just click the $ at the bottom of the chat box, and that way it'll send in your Super Chat. Any host of the live shows can see it, they'll read it out loud, and that way we can carry on the conversation, maybe bring it to a different area that we weren't currently on. It always makes the show much more entertaining and much more interactive, so we're always in favor of that. And just let us know what you're thinking, hit the Super Chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and as exciting as possible. Again, hit the $ at the bottom of the chat box and just let us know what's on your mind on anything regarding any of these topics. But now that we could start officially with the show going forward, we're going to preview one of the playoff games right off the bat, looking at the Chargers and the Texans game, the first game that we have on the playoff schedule this upcoming weekend. This game is set to take place on Saturday it's set to take place at 4:30. I almost said 1 o'clock. It's set to take place at 4:30 on Saturday. It's the first game on the schedule for these playoffs, and this is the 4-5 matchup in the AFC. Our first game, like I said, of this year's playoffs in Houston, because Houston is the division winner, and the Chargers got a little bump up in their win last week to the number 5 seed over the Steelers that dropped down 1 spot to the 6 seed. So this is a area where, the Texans are going to be trying to repeat what happened last year. They hosted a playoff game last year against the Cleveland Browns, and they absolutely smoked them. So they're going to try and repeat that this upcoming Saturday against a Chargers team that believes that they're really trying to change the narrative, that they're not the same old Chargers team. And I think they've convinced a lot of people, including myself, that this is just not the same old Chargers team that looks exciting. They get into the playoffs and they just completely drop the ball once they realize it's a different aspect, a different scenario in playoff football. I don't feel like I'm talking about the same team. And as we get more into it, we'll talk more about that. But this is one of 2 wildcard games where the road team actually comes in as the favorite. As of right now, the Chargers are the favorites in this game, only by 3 points. And like I mentioned before, the Chargers earned this spot by winning 3 of their last games, along with the loss that the Steelers had that helped them move up to this spot. And like we talked about before, I thought this was the most favorable matchup that anybody could get. Not really as a disrespect to the Houston Texans, but much more of a, I guess, as a positive aspect for the Ravens, the Bills, and the Chiefs. I just think they're at a different level, and the Texans are a lot younger than all those other teams, right? They have a lot more experience, playoff experience on those sides rather than the Houston Texans do. But I mean, it's the playoffs, right? Anything can happen. But to me, if we're going to talk about it like that, I felt like the Texans gave you the best opportunity to win, and clearly I wasn't too far off because the Chargers are the favorites on the road. And more on this game, I mean, I mentioned how the Chargers won their last 3 games. Houston has also, won 3 of their last 5 games, but those 2 losses that they had were to Kansas City and to Baltimore in some pretty ugly results, right? They basically got shut out by the Ravens at home, and against the Chiefs. It was pretty close, but they unfortunately lost one of their weapons in Tank Dell. So that left a very sour taste in their mouth. And moving forward on this matchup specifically, these are 2 teams that have never met before actually in the playoffs. The last time the Chargers were in the playoffs, it was a 27-point collapse to the Jacksonville Jaguars, which was the 3rd largest comeback in playoff history. That was only a couple seasons ago, where Brandon Staley was still the coach over there in Los Angeles, and that wasn't even too far away from where we are now, but it feels like almost an eternity away just because of how different this Chargers team looks and plays and almost acts in a way as well. Everything about them, has changed. Credit to Jim Harbaugh. So that's very reassuring if you're a Chargers fan. And more on this matchup, these 2 teams have only met 9 times before because of how pretty recent, the Texans are as a franchise pretty much. And in those 9 meetings, the Chargers actually have the advantage over the Texans with a 6-3 record. And also the Chargers have won 4 times when playing in Houston as well. And on the Texans side of things, this is C.J. Stroud's first time ever playing the Los Angeles Chargers as well. So, I mean, C.J. Stroud, just on that note, 1-1 in his early playoff record. He played very well last year, and that was only his first year. You'd hope that he'd build on that, right, going into this year, and hopefully kind of put all these 50-50 narratives away on them, because I'm sure a lot of people like myself are feeling unsure about the Texans just based on their health and how they're playing. So CJ Stroud's obviously going to have a big impact on that going into this game. And now, looking at the more negative side of this matchup and looking at some of the injuries, offensive lineman Shaq Mason for the Houston Texans did not participate in practice so far this week. He's been dealing with a knee injury, and now that I'm looking at the injury reports up until this point, with Shaq Mason not having practiced so far, he has already been ruled out for the Houston Texans, so he's not going to be able to play until the divisional round if the Texans get there. John Mechie, one of their wide receivers, has been dealing with a shoulder. He's still questionable, as well is defensive lineman D'Amico Autry. They were both limited in practice yesterday. I'm pretty sure they were at least limited or full participants today, but they are still labeled as questionable going into these games. And then the 2 biggest ones come on the side of the Los Angeles Chargers, because both of their wide receivers, Joshua Palmer and Quentin Johnson, are dealing with injuries. Joshua Palmer is a little bit more severe. He's already been ruled out with the foot injury that he's been dealing with, so he's not going to be able to play. While Quentin Johnson, he's still labeled as questionable on here, dealing with a thigh issue and as well as an illness now, so that'll be pushed a little bit closer to game time, or at least tomorrow we're going to have a better idea of it. But for right now, he is still labeled as questionable, and for a Chargers team that already offensively isn't, blowing anybody away, those are huge losses if Quentin Johnson is also unable to play. And then, before we get into our matchups, one thing I'd like to see from each of these teams, a goal in mind that I want to see them accomplish in order for them to reach the ultimate, prize, right? Reaching the victory in this game. For the Chargers is, I really want to see them try and impose their will right away as the visiting team. And not only as the visiting team, but to kind of prove to everybody that they're really all about the run game, that they are this tough-nosed, gritty team that they are perceived as, but maybe some people aren't really buying it. And what better way to do it than going out there and bullying the home team and ended up winning the game overall. And I think they're able to do it because this Houston Texans team, and some of their losses, they've given up a lot of rushing yards to these running backs, like against the Tennessee Titans in that surprising win by the Titans in Houston. Tony Pollard ran for 119 yards. Derrick Henry ran for 147 yards a couple weeks ago when also the Ravens traveled to Houston, and the Kansas City Chiefs as a whole team also rushed for 124 yards. So with J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, I think they're very capable of doing that, and I think that should be a point of emphasis for them going into this game. And then for the Texans, for them, I think it's a lot simpler, just in the matter of, I feel like they have to do everything they can to try and disrupt Justin Herbert as much as they can. Bring a lot of pressure, try to man them up, going in man coverage specifically, and seeing how successful you are with bringing Will Anderson, with bringing Danielle Hunter, obviously, with having Christian Harris rush the passer as well. Bring all these guys to kind of be in Justin Herbert's face, make him uncomfortable, knock him down, just make his rhythm very off. Because up until this point, Justin Herbert's been very rhythmic. He's had everything out in time. Everything's going very smoothly for this offense. So I think if you throw off the timing a little bit, kind of like the Lions did with the Minnesota Vikings, especially now that Joshua Palmer's not playing, I think it's going to be huge for them. And they got the guys to do it, which leads us into the matchups. One of them that I'm looking at is Derek Stingley and Kamari Lassiter, the cornerbacks for the Houston Texans, going up against Ladd McConkey and potentially Quentin Johnson. What's interesting about this is Ladd McConkey and Kamari Lassiter playing on opposite sides. They're both rookies, and they both played at the University of Georgia. They were actually teammates, so that would be super, just neat of a fact that, they're playing against each other in their first playoff game. Probably going to be matched up against each other a couple times, so that's going to be a fascinating matchup. And Derek Stingley, whether he's on Ladd McConkey or Quentin Johnson, he has been voted to a Pro Bowl this year as well, so he has also not gone unnoticed as well. So especially if they want to implement the goal and the strategy that I just suggested with pressuring Justin Herbert a lot, you're going to need Derek Stingley and Kamari Lassiter to be successful in man coverage. And I think they're capable of doing that with those guys that they have in their secondary. And then the other matchup that I'm looking forward to is just basically the offensive line going up against the defensive line of each team and vice versa, right? We have Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa against the Houston Texans offensive line that has had C.J. Stroud sacked the second most amount of times in the NFL, while on the other side of things, you got Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter going up against a Chargers offensive line with a rookie at the tackle position, and Justin Herbert, who's been sacked the seventh most amount of times, 41 times to be exact. So both these guys are in the top 10 of being sacked in terms of quarterbacks. So which pass rush can be more successful? And especially now that we know Shaq Mason isn't playing, that could be another weak point that the Chargers should try and exploit and really throw C.J. Stroud off his game, especially with all those injuries. You kind of know which way he's going to be looking towards in Nico Collins. So right now, I would say the matchup is a little bit more in favor of the Chargers because of those injuries. And for our final predictions here, who I think is going to win in the first playoff game that we have, I would like to go with the Los Angeles Chargers just because I like how first-year defensive coordinator Jesse Minter and this Chargers defense can really get after C.J. Stroud. I was under the impression that Shaq Mason was probably going to play, but now that he's also out and, it's unfortunate that CJ doesn't have all of his weapons. I think that's going to be a real problem for them to kind of make him uncomfortable and force him to make some tight throws where maybe it could lead to some turnovers. So I like that about the Chargers, along with the fact that, I just trust Justin Herbert a little bit more. I think we're really starting to see the kind of quarterback that he really is when he has a coach like Jim Harbaugh and a system that really benefits him. I just trust him a little bit more than CJ Stroud up until this point, just based on what I've seen so far this season. So I'm going to go with the Chargers. They're going to get the road victory and move on to potentially play the Chiefs or the Bills, depending on other results. But speaking of other playoff games, we're going to preview another one here to start the show. The second game that we have coming up this upcoming weekend, this one between the Ravens and the Steelers. Another AFC North matchup between these two. It's the tiebreaker. The Ravens have won one. The Steelers have won one. Who's going to come away with the ultimate tiebreaker in the playoffs? I'll let you guys know that when we return after this break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alright guys, we're back on here on the show to continue talking about the playoffs, the wild card games that we have coming up this weekend. I'm only going to go through the Saturday games before tomorrow I go into the Sunday games and a couple more topics, but the second one that we have coming up on Saturday is we get to see the third matchup between the Steelers and the Ravens this season. Like I mentioned before, they've already split the regular season series that they have, only 2 games, one in Pittsburgh, one in Baltimore, obviously, with the Steelers and Ravens both winning on their home fields. But this time around, where the first 2 games, they might have been looked upon as a lot more close in terms of how competitive each team's going to be against each other. This time around, the Ravens enter as heavy favorites. Actually, the Ravens enter this game as the largest favored team in these playoffs, in this wild card round. They enter as 9.5-point favorites as of this morning, and that's the largest difference between any of the games that we have going on this weekend. And why that is because Pittsburgh have barely, you want to talk about limp into this stage of the competition. They're basically crawling to the wild card round, right? That's how bad it's been over their last 4 games. They've obviously lost all of them, and they've been outscored 109-57, and they're trying to win their first playoff game since 2016. A very long playoff drought, almost a decade since they won their last playoff game, and it's just so far below the standard, obviously, of the Steelers, and it's just a big blemish on Mike Tomlin, unfortunately, right? Because he is the head coach. He's the presumed leader of this team. And to have something like that, largely standing out over everything, it seems a bit unfair to some extent. But also, they haven't been able to get it done. So how unfair could it really be, right? You just got to get it done in the wild card round, right? And they've just not been able to do it. They've had a lot of slow and bad endings to these regular seasons, and just carries into the playoffs. So that's a lot on their doing, quite honestly. And, this first game, talking about the Steelers and the Ravens just overall from this year, the first game was very heavy on the defensive side of the ball. It was only 18-16 in favor of the Steelers, while the second game looked pretty lopsided just based on the final score. But really, the Steelers were in that game. They were only losing by a touchdown when Lamar Jackson threw that interception to Minkah Fitzpatrick, and the Steelers were in a position where they took the ball away, obviously, and that they could go and tie the game. But then Russell Wilson throws that pick six, and from that point on, the game is pretty much out of reach while they are down 14 points at that point after that pick six. And not to mention the fumble that Russell Wilson had at the 3-yard line as well, that kind of threw everything off for the Steelers. They lost the turnover battle, and you just can't do that when your margin of error is so small. And that stems from not as much talent on the offensive side of the ball as these other teams. So you really got to play perfect for you to even have a legitimate chance of winning. And for the majority of these games that they've lost, they haven't been able to do that as well. But, the last time, if we're going to be looking at the positives for the Steelers in this game, there was no George Pickens last time. And they were still, in that game like I mentioned. And really, overall, the Steelers hold a 3-1 record against Baltimore when they've played in the playoffs. So take that for what you will, but, we are talking about right now. So, it's looking pretty lopsided in that regard. And also, George Pickens isn't coming off of his best game, per se, and it's getting kind of awkward over there in Pittsburgh. At least around the organization. Maybe within it, it's all regular. They don't really hear all the outside noise. But around the organization, I feel like there's a lot more of a high tension, not as much tolerance for George Pickens, especially after, the antics and things like that, and especially last game where he dropped a lot of passes. It's not going great as of right now for the Steelers wide receiver, so he definitely needs to have a big game. But looking forward now to the injuries in this game, there's not too many big ones in terms of the Steelers. I mean, Chris Boswell and Cam Hayward were unable to practice yesterday because they were dealing with some illnesses, some flu-like symptoms in Hayward's case. And for Chris Boswell, I'm pretty sure it was just a regular sickness. I didn't really read too much into it, or it just wasn't labeled as anything specific. But those were really the biggest ones. Dante Jackson, he was a full participant all week, so it looks like he's going to be able to play. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the Steelers' current starting offensive lineman, Mason McCormick, broke his hand last week against the Bengals, but he could either play in this game, but just going to have to wear a big brace on his hand, or he is in danger of missing the game. So that's really the biggest injury for the Steelers as of right now. They're pretty fortunate to be heading into this game with everybody. It hasn't been the case for a couple seasons now in the past, so that's something good for the Steelers. But really the biggest injury news comes from the side of the Baltimore Ravens, because today their head coach John Harbaugh announced that Zay Flowers will not be playing in this game. He is still dealing with that knee injury, and because the game is on Saturday, right, it's almost like today's Friday in a regular week, so he hasn't practiced up until this point, and really very limited to no practice time by this point in a regular week. You are trending towards not playing, and John Harbaugh made that news official this week. I don't think they've mentioned the specifics of the knee injury. It's just, it's pretty much day-to-day, week-to-week. I'm sure if they move on, he's going to play next week, but, he wasn't able to get it through for this upcoming first round of the playoffs. So the Ravens are going to be without their first-time Pro Bowl receiver in Zay Flowers, which is huge because, he logged over 1,000 yards, and he had 74 receptions on the year, and like I said, he recorded his first Pro Bowl. That's the first time the Ravens have drafted a wide receiver that's made the Pro Bowl. So clearly they definitely hit on Zay Flowers, but he won't be able to play for them this upcoming weekend. And with that in mind now, we're going to move on to our goals that we have for each team, something that they need to make sure they do in order to get the victory on Saturday for the Baltimore Ravens. What I'd like to see them do that I think would be very beneficial for them would be in their secondary, in their coverages, in just how they line up and try to deceive the coverages for Russell Wilson. Try and trick him, try and show him something and then quickly rotate off of it or something like that. Try to make it as difficult as possible for Russell Wilson and the Steelers offense to kind of decide what they're doing. That you already know that they're pretty limited when it comes to playmaking on that side of the ball. It's pretty much just George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth, and probably Calvin Austin. That's about it. So try and switch up the looks, switch in a lot of zones, different zones, man coverage, make it look like man coverage, but it's actually zone. 2 high safeties versus 1 high. Everything you could possibly do, try to throw it at the Steelers' way. Because they are so limited, you kind of know where they're going with the football. And so far through these last 4 games, they haven't been very active in throwing near the middle of the field. So you can try to use that to your advantage as much as you can to kind of force them into some throws, take away the outside throws so they're kind of out of their comfort zone. And really, if you make them believe that they have a deep pass kind of option with the kind of coverage that they are seeing, and then it quickly changes halfway through the play, that'll also play in your favor, obviously, because then Russ has to tuck it. He kind of has to scramble to look for somebody else, and that Steelers offensive line hasn't been looking great for them to kind of just be back there, kind of just buying time. So I think that would be huge for the Ravens to kind of do that against the Steelers on Saturday. And then for the Steelers, I mean, the only thing I really need to just see them do, I'm begging, is to switch up the monotony, the kind of schedule, the rhythm of their play calling, because I can't be sitting at home watching the game knowing that they're going to run it every single time on first and second down. I can't know that when I'm at home, because if I know it, then the Baltimore Ravens obviously know it, and everybody else watching the game knows it, and it just makes it easy, right? I can't know that every first down you're going to run it an outside zone or a toss play, because then it's a lot easier for the Ravens. You're not really challenging them in that aspect, right? You have to try and keep them on their toes, and you get behind the chains more often than not, and then you're really out of your comfort zone. So for everything, please, for the Steelers, just need to just switch that up. Throw it once in a while on first down. It's not going to kill you as much as it is anyway that you're losing yards. So that's something that I think they need to do against the Ravens, right? Because you have nothing to lose, right? The Steelers might as well try everything because they're not favored. They're going on the road, so it's not going to hurt them anyway, right? Nobody thinks they're going to win at this point. So that is something I'd like to see for the Steelers to give them their best chance at least at winning this game. And then in terms of matchups, it kind of goes along the same way. George Pickens going up against the Ravens secondary against Marlon Humphrey, or Stevens on the other side. Stevens gets flagged a lot, and George Pickens didn't play their last time in Baltimore, where you look at a guy like Marlon Humphrey on the other side as well, and he's had 2 interceptions off of Russell Wilson. So that matchup now, where it's for all the marbles, having George Pickens there this time in Baltimore, it'll certainly change up the coverages, right? But definitely be aware of Marlon Humphrey, right, if you're Russell Wilson. And then the Ravens outside pass rush going up against the Steelers tackles, because Kyle Van Noy's been very good. He's been very effective for them. It always feels like he gets a sack each and every game. And on the opposite side for the Steelers, Dan Moore, their left tackle, has not been very good at all. He started the season off pretty well, but recently he's just been getting beat too easily, and it just hasn't given Russell Wilson the amount of time to throw the ball. And Russ isn't going to escape the pocket and run for like 20 yards, so he definitely needs that. So that's something the Ravens could definitely take advantage of on Dan Moore's side and Broderick Jones' side, but Broderick Jones has been playing better. Then the last one is just going to be the obvious one, right? The Ravens wide receivers going up against the Steelers defensive back. This is one of the only and most recent time that the Steelers secondary has been completely healthy. Dante Jackson is going to be playing this game along with Joey Porter Jr. And for the Ravens, I mean, they can't say the same thing because Zay Flowers isn't going to play on the opposite side. So does that mean the Steelers could maybe play a little bit more man coverage, a little bit more single high on these guys, on Rashad Bateman, on, I don't even know who their other receivers are, on like Mark Andrews or Isaiah Likely or anything like that? Could they play more man coverage, and could that allow them to bring more people down into the box to try and stop Derrick Henry. That could be something if they feel confident in doing that. But, I mean, again, you have to switch it up. You can't just run the same thing every time. But I think that's an avenue that they can explore because Zay Flowers is a lot more dangerous in man coverage because he's a lot more shiftier, and it's hard to get your hands on him as well. So the fact that he's not playing, I think, would definitely benefit Pittsburgh to play a little bit more man coverage and try and stop Derrick Henry and really keep Lamar Jackson from doing Lamar Jackson sort of things. But all in all, when it comes to predicting, I have to go with Baltimore. Just one, so I don't look like a homer picking the Steelers, but also it's just you have an MVP on one side and also arguably an offensive player of the year as well. And on the Steelers side, you just can't see how, if it's just offense for offense, blow for blow, how the Steelers could really keep up in this regard, especially how well the Ravens are playing and just how slow and disruptive the Steelers offense has been. So I don't love their chances. They don't have momentum on their side at all. And Mike Tomlin is 1-6 in playoff games when he's the underdog. So this is going to be one of his tallest tasks to kind of overcome. Is it capable of happening? Sure. But is it likely? And am I going to pick it? Probably not. So I'm going to go with the Ravens at home for them to win. Because if they don't, it's going to be a huge, catastrophe if they don't beat this Steelers team, right? So we're going to go with the Ravens. I'm going to go with them to beat the Steelers. So those are the two previews that we're going to go through in today's show. Then tomorrow we're going to go through the other games on the weekend as well. But we're not going to move too far off the playoffs because we're going to be looking at every team's most important player in this year's playoffs. We're going to only focus on the AFC in today's show, and then tomorrow we're going to get to the NFC, but we're going to go through each team, a couple of the teams that I already mentioned, and just pick their most important player, in my opinion. Which player is going to be huge for them to make sure they get a victory in not only the first round, but going forward. So I'm going to let you guys know my picks when we return in just a few seconds.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
We are back now on the Chip Shot Football Podcast here. Again, Thursday, January 9th, just a couple days away from the start of the playoffs. And moving away from the previews just a little bit for today's show, I thought I'd look at a wider range of the playoffs a little bit and just go through the AFC side of the bracket and kind of decipher which players are the ones that are the X factors, the kind of catalyst to trying to make sure that each respected team is able to do what they want to do, right? Which player is going to be so significant that they're either going to win because of them or they're going to lose because this player was not able, to fulfill his expectations in these upcoming games. So we're going to go through each AFC team and just basically pick which player I think is the most important one for them to try and go out and get a win. And for time's sake, like I mentioned before, we're only going to go through the AFC in today's show, and then tomorrow we're going to get to the NFC. So without further ado, the first team I have on here is the Houston Texans, right? Off of that matchup, they're one of the first teams to play. And to me, the player that absolutely must make an impact in this game and has to make an impact in this game for the Texans to win, I'm going to go ahead and say it's Joe Mixon. It's Joe Mixon for me because I think the theme around these playoffs is that one of the prerequisites of these playoffs, I think, is that you have to have a very, at least average running game. Something that the opposing team has to respect, right? You look at the Chiefs, the Lions, the Vikings, the Chargers, all these teams, the Ravens, have a running game that you have to respect. And, the ones that kind of get whittled out are the ones that don't have that running game, right? Like maybe you start to predict like the Steelers or something like that, or maybe even the Broncos, right? So I think those are going to be huge for this game. And having Joe Mixon in his first season as a Texan this year, I think it's going to be huge for them, especially with the injuries to Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell. You need somebody else to step up, right? I'm expecting Dalton Schultz to kind of be targeted a little bit more. Nico Collins is going to do his thing. John Mechie, obviously, they're going to have to rely on him, but you need to switch it up. You need to change the pace a little bit with Joe Mixon. And he started the season on fire, and it's unfortunate that he got hurt on that hip drop tackle, I think week 3 against the Chicago Bears, and it kind of threw everything off. But in those first couple weeks, right, Joe Mixon looked like the best addition in all of the NFL, almost arguably up there with Saquon and Derrick Henry through the first 3 weeks, right? So he needs to have an imprint in this game, especially against a Chargers team where they also want to play this way, right? I mentioned that was something I wanted to see the Chargers do, go out there and really run the ball at this Texans team. So I feel like the Texans got to kind of punch back and do the same thing to them with their running back. So I think Joe Mixon's going to be huge for them. Also in the passing game, he's very capable of doing that as well. And if he has a good game, I think the Texans give themselves the best shot at winning this game at home. Again, because they're not favored. So if they want to win this game, he's going to have a big impact in it as well. Then in that same matchup, we're just going to go down the line and look at the Chargers. I didn't know Quentin Johnson was dealing with a good amount, but he's my player that I selected for the Chargers. He's the one that I think needs to have a good game. One, because I didn't want to pick quarterbacks because I think they're pretty easy. And we're obviously not going to talk about the number 1 seeds because they're not playing. And I didn't want to just kind of have a cop-out with Justin Herbert. So I went with Quentin Johnston because the biggest thing around him and the biggest thing around the Chargers that everybody was mentioning was that, this offense is good. It's great that they want to run the ball, and they have a very capable personnel to do that with the offensive line and J.K. Dobbins. But the thing that we lamented was the fact that they didn't have, the wide receivers that they used to, right? Keenan and Mike Williams. Obviously, they would have been great additions, but they had to let them go because of salary cap situations, right? So they had to move on from them. And now they're very fortunate that they have Ladd McConkey. Ladd McConkey's already looking like their best receiver just in terms of consistency, and you still need more, right? You can't just have one guy, especially a rookie. You can't just depend on him right away, right? Because he's already doing a lot in his first year, right? The first year for rookies is insane. So I think a guy like Quentin Johnston, who's coming off of his best career game against the Raiders, he had 13 receptions for 86 yards. He has all the physical tools to go out and give you stat lines like that, but it's been the drops and, those sort of, I don't like saying boneheaded plays, but just those kind of weird looking plays where it just does not go well at all for Quentin Johnston. So, he just had a great game for them, and if he's able to kind of get past that, get past the drops, and really contribute, he doesn't have to have 100 yards each game, but if he's able to have like 5 receptions, 6 receptions for like 70-something, 60-something yards, I think that'll go a long way for them because they really want to run the ball. And if they can get some sort of production from Quentin Johnston and Ladd McConkey, I think it's going to be great for this Chargers offense because then it almost makes it look as complete and as competitive as you would have thought in only their first year, right? They're only going to get better, but Quentin Johnston, if he could turn that corner, is going to be huge for this Chargers offense going into this year's playoffs. And then moving down the line again, we got the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, I went with Derrick Henry because the main thing around the Ravens has been that they've always been around the top of the AFC. You know, they were the number 1 seed last year, and they had home field advantage, and you know, they ended up still losing to the Kansas City Chiefs because they went away from what everybody thought was their identity, but they got a little bit too cute with it, and they tried to pass themselves out of that game rather than sticking true to the run game, having Lamar run, and using that running game a lot more than they should have, or a lot more than they actually did. So I think now when you add a guy like Derrick Henry, he has to be the difference this year, right? Because the team is virtually the same. And you add a guy, the capacity and the capabilities of Derrick Henry, he has to be the obvious difference maker, right? Or else what else did you bring him in for, right? You could say that you brought him in to, you know, emphasize or just make better, improve the rest of the team like Lamar and the passing game, obviously, right? Because you have to worry about Derrick Henry. But that can only go so far, I believe, right? Until one team, you know, decides to just say, you know, forget all of that. We're going to focus on this passing game and see if you could beat us with Derrick Henry, which sounds crazy. It sounds backwards, right? But I think they have to make it like one of their personal goals each week to get him 20, 23, 24 carries at least each game and really have him make an impact in the game. Because if he's just sitting there and you end up losing one of these games, the last thing you want to do is look back on it and say, oh, we should have used Derrick Henry more. Like, that's obvious. That's obviously one of the things you have to do. So he is my player that I selected for them. And then moving on to their opponent, the Pittsburgh Steelers, I actually went with Pat Freiermuth. I went with Pat Freiermuth because instead of George Pickens, because I think without Freiermuth last week against the Bengals, they probably score 10 points, maybe less, if he's not playing. That's how bad this offense looked. And obviously George Pickens is the main one. He's the main attraction when defenses are trying to prepare for the Steelers. But quite simply, they just need somebody else to do something to contribute in any way possible, because similarly to the Chargers, right? It can't just be Ladd McConkey. It can't just be George Pickens on the Steelers. It can't just be Josh Allen on the Bills. It can't just be Cortland Sutton. It needs to be a team effort now more than ever. And, I mean, you look at the Chiefs, and they have a bunch of guys, maybe not a tier 1 A-plus receiver like they used to have, but they got a lot of guys that are contributing, which makes them so dangerous. And I think the Steelers need George Pickens in this game more than ever, especially because they don't like throwing in the middle of the field, and that's where usually tight ends operate. So the more they could use Pat Freiermuth, not only is it going to help them kind of get through each portion of the field, but also with a tight end, I think it allows the quarterbacks to get in rhythm more. So I think using him to kind of get Russ going and kind of build some sort of momentum is going to be huge for the Steelers. So Freiermuth, hopefully he can try and replicate what he did against the Bengals. And then the last matchup we have on here between the Bills and the Broncos, the player I selected for the Bills is James Cook. I selected James Cook, and really you could have selected the entire running back room because they use like 3 guys, or really 2 guys, but James Cook is the presumed starter, so I went with him because all I've heard so far about this game is how the Broncos defense matches up very well. You have to worry about Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, Zach Allen, Pat Surtain on one-on-one coverage. Like the Bills could be on upset alert, right? And it is possible. Like, I don't think that's crazy, but I think it's been kind of like if you're the Bills, you got to be like, all right, everyone's got to relax. Like, we are the number 2 seed for a reason, and I think James Cook is going to be a huge part in kind of showing everybody why it's not just all about Josh Allen. Maybe a majority of it is, but James Cook is also someone that you have to watch out for. And the way that you kind of get those pass rushers to not come off the ball with such speed and explosiveness is kind of just running the ball at them, making them defend the run, And if they're unable to do that, then you're not in such obvious passing situations, right? You get what I mean? It's like when you're throwing the ball so much, you get yourself into 2nd and 8s, 3rd and 9s, 3rd and 7s, and things like that. So you're obviously going to pass the ball. The pass rushers know that, so they're going to know when to get off the ball and know that the quarterback is going to have the ball in his hands. But if you're running it, which I think James Cook could really do, obviously, is when you're running the ball, then you kind of move the chains. Now you're in 2nd and 4, 3rd and 1s, 3rd and 2s. It's not obvious that you're going to pass the ball. So the pass rushers are kind of holding back because they don't want to get out of their gaps and everything like that. So that's kind of how you counter the Broncos pass rush in this aspect. And also, when it comes to that secondary, because I think their secondary matches up very well against the Bills, but in that regard, make those cornerbacks come up and tackle, make them get off blocks, right? Run toss plays, run outside zones, run read options and things like that, right? Make it so James Cook is on the outside and you have to have Riley Moss go up there and tackle him. You have to have Pat Surtain come off of a block and try to tackle James Cook. All of these little things are kind of just like, in a boxing reference, kind of just like body shots, right? Until you finally get a big run to break off, and it could end up being the difference in this game. So I think James Cook is going to be huge for them to kind of counter that Broncos pass rush in this game. And then lastly for the Broncos here, I have Courtland Sutton. I have Courtland Sutton because the running game is obviously important, and I don't want to, diminish that. But I think with a target like Courtland Sutton, you have to really fully use him, right? I never liked thinking that when you have a weapon like him, George Pickens, or Derrick Henry even, like I mentioned, you don't want to look back in a loss and say, oh, we should have got them the ball more, right? You got to turn every possible stone that you can. And especially against the Buffalo Bills, where physically, all their corners are 6'2" and below, while Courtland Sutton is a very much 6'4". He is an actual 6'4" wide receiver. So not only does he have the physical advantage, but also if you look back at the Bills' previous games, they're not really like a man-to-man sort of team. They like to run zone a lot, and if you remember to that Rams game, Puka Nacua killed their zone, and they run it so much because you'd like to think that they're not very comfortable in man coverage. So you got to try and take advantage of that with a guy like Courtland Sutton. And, Bo Nix, going into his first playoff game, he needs to know that he can rely on a guy like Courtland Sutton. He needs to know that he could get him the ball early and often. So, I think he needs to draw a lot of attention, and if anything at all, just draw the attention, right? Because then that'll affect everything else, and then maybe you get Marvin Mims involved, or Troy Franklin and these guys. So I think Courtland Sutton has to affect the game in some sort of way, right? You just can't give him a quick look and then turn away. You got to try and get him the ball as much as possible. So all those guys that I just ran through, all those guys I think are the most important piece for each AFC team to try and get a victory in this first round, but also going forward. So we'll see how accurate I am, and we'll see how efficient those guys are this upcoming weekend. But now we're going to turn away a little bit from the playoffs and look at two other stories in the last couple segments here. One of them being the 49ers. They've made a couple moves here already with the offseason in mind. So we're going to go through them, and I'm just going to give my quick thoughts on them because they are pretty important all in all. So we'll be right back and talk a little bit more about the 49ers and this upcoming offseason.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
We are back now on the show quickly here to just go through the 49ers a little bit. I didn't think I would be focusing on them solely for a segment this early, talking about the offseason, but they've been one of the teams, really one of the only teams that I like to say has made the most amount of moves so far, so early, and I guess the offseason portion for most of the rest of the NFL that did it. They've made a couple moves that'll impact how this team is trying to operate in 2025. And the earliest bit of news here, the most obvious one for me, was the 49ers' decision to not bring back their defensive coordinator, Nick Sorensen. Nick Sorensen, he got the promotion this year. I believe he was the passing game coordinator or the passing game specialist on the defensive side of the ball. It was something like that where, after, there was some departures and after Raheem Morris, I believe, left for the Falcons job, or actually, it might not have been Raheem Morris. I forget who their last defensive coordinator was, but regardless of that, Nick Sorensen got the promotion, and already it looked a little bit weird because they also brought in Brandon Staley to kind of be a supervisor in that regard to the defensive side of the ball. It looked weird because he was the assistant head coach, and also you could kind of see where the 49ers were trying to go with that move, kind of just overlook things on the defensive side of the ball with Nick Sorensen kind of getting a promotion like this for the first time. So, this year defensively, it didn't go according to plan, I would say, because their defense ranked 29th in points allowed, 25.6 points per game, which was the most they've allowed since 2020. So I felt like a move needed to be made. There was a lot of injuries, to Talanoa Hufanga, and Treverius Ward missed some time accordingly, as he should have, for the loss in his family, but Dre Greenlaw also was injured. Javon Hargrave missed most of the year. Nick Bosa missed a couple games. So there is that aspect, but I think a move definitely needed to be made. And now, looking towards the future, NFL insider Josina Anderson reported that the 49ers would actually be willing to offer their defensive coordinator position to their former defensive coordinator, Robert Saleh. Robert Saleh was actually the one in there before. Was one of the recent ones for the 49ers, right? He was their defensive coordinator from 2017 to 2020. He left in 2021 for the Jets head coaching position. So, with him not having, let's say, a solidified job going into 2025, I know he's with the Packers right now, but I don't know how solid and guaranteed that position is for the following year. The 49ers are willing to have him come back as their defensive coordinator, which would be pretty interesting and would be a move that I wouldn't be against it whatsoever. I think that would be a pretty nice reunion for them. Robert Saleh produced some pretty good defenses with them, and he has also a head coaching opportunity with the Jaguars. He is interviewing with them as well, but it doesn't look like he's going to bring in a lot of interest from a bunch of other teams. So I think that would be a good decision by Saleh, just to go back to the 49ers and really take over a group that he's very familiar with Bosa, Fred, Dre Greenlaw if he comes back. So I don't really hate the move. I would actually like to see it happen. All in all, again, if Robert Saleh can't get a better position, I'd like to see him go back to the 49ers. And then staying on the coaching side of things with the 49ers, Kyle Shanahan actually announced yesterday that Clay Kubiak, who was their offensive passing game specialist this season, he will now be their offensive coordinator heading into 2025. But that does not mean he's going to be able to call the plays. That is still going to be Kyle Shanahan, but Clay Kubiak will have other responsibilities to do as the offensive coordinator, and this is actually only the second time Kyle Shanahan has had an offensive coordinator during his time there with the 49ers. The other one was Mike McDaniel, now the head coach of the Miami Dolphins. That was the only other time Shanahan has had an offensive coordinator. So, I mean, I don't know the specifics to it all, but if you're not calling the plays, if you're not really setting the offense as you would have liked, it doesn't really make too much of a change. But I mean, it's great to see for Clay Kubiak. I mean, the Kubiaks are moving pretty fast up the coaching ranks, right? I mean, Clay Kubiak's now the OC in San Francisco. Clint Kubiak had a pretty decent start to the year in New Orleans, so hopefully he gets an opportunity somewhere. If not this offseason, but the next. And I mean, in regards to this move, I'm sure it's not going to change too much, but it's still a pretty significant thing to kind of talk about just because it's only the second time it's happened under Kyle Shanahan. So we'll leave that there. And then another piece of information that's pretty significant when it comes to the 49ers and what this team could look like in 2025 has to do with free agency. And free agency, the biggest one, or really one of the biggest ones for me, was confirmed by General Manager John Lynch, where he made it known either yesterday or on Tuesday that they are probably going to designate their defensive tackle, Javon Hargrave, to be a post-June 1st release after they restructured his 4-year deal last month in order to create some cap relief. They've restructured it with the intention of having him test the market for himself this offseason and see what's out there for him, especially because they are a little bit tight when it comes to cap space, because obviously you have Brock Purdy's contract coming up and you want to make sure you have enough for that, obviously, right? But Javon Hargrave just recently signed that 4-year contract, so it comes at a bit of a surprise because he is one of their best players there in the middle of their defensive line. So the fact that they're going to see what his market is and see, what kind of teams are interested in him, it's pretty interesting to me just because I didn't think they were going to allow him to do that. He's definitely going to get a lot of interest in the free agent market from other teams. It's just really kind of up to the negotiations at that point, whether or not other teams want to take him and that contract up, especially with him coming off of that torn tricep injury that kept him out of this entire year, basically. So that'll be interesting, seeing if the 49ers are able to keep one of their most prominent, defensive linemen. But clearly, it is something that the 49ers, they want to keep Javon Hargrave, but they acknowledge the fact that, they are going to go through with this and see what happens in the end. But one free agent that they don't want to see leave is their linebacker, Drake Greenlaw. Drake Greenlaw is currently in the last year of his contract, and he signed a contract extension back in 2022, and that was only a 2-year extension, so that only runs through this year. So he's scheduled to be an unrestricted free agent in March, but the 49ers have the negotiating rights for him until, March, obviously. So far, Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch have made it a point of emphasis that they don't want to lose Drake Greenlaw. They don't think that just because they haven't extended him, that's just it. They're not going to get him back. They are very optimistic that they could re-sign him and kind of work something out during the offseason. And I've heard a lot of other players talk about Drake Greenlaw and how they don't want to see him leave also. So I think Kyle Shanahan has even made it a point that that's their number one priority, is to keep Drake Greenlaw. So it'll be interesting to see how those negotiations go with a 27-year-old linebacker that's very much in the prime of his career, but is also coming off of that Achilles injury, right? That's always a tricky one to kind of maneuver. So I'd like to see him stay with the 49ers. I think he's me, and maybe that gauges his interest to go somewhere else depending on the situation. So that's the risk that comes with free agency, right? Obviously, we're not going to get into all of that, right? Because we're still in this current season, right? We're not going to talk about the offseason until we're fully through this season, but that's also something that could be a top free agent target once we get to that point. And lastly here, in regards to free agency, John Lynch also stressed that they don't plan on moving on from Deebo Samuel in 2025, despite the poor production, I think you could say, this year from Deebo, and next year will be the last year in his contract as well. He had an extension done back in 2022, and he has a cap hit of $16 million as well. But despite all, John Lynch says that the 49ers are not in the business of getting rid of good players, right? So he's putting his confidence in Deebo Samuel. I'm sure he realizes that this year was just a down year for everybody, and he's not lost confidence in Deebo Samuel whatsoever, it looks like. But I think it is something just to keep an eye on because, they gave Brandon Ayuk a lot of money already, and with Brock Purdy's deal coming up, right, I don't know how the numbers look right now, especially if you want to bring back Dre Greenlaw and what kind of effect that would have on the cap, right? It's a very tricky situation where you got a lot of good players, and unfortunately you can't pay all of them what they would like to be paid. So that'll be something to watch. Right now, it doesn't look like they're willing to move on from him, but like we've seen already, a lot can change, especially from now, mid-January, to all the way into the summer. So that could be something to watch. Maybe some teams are interested in Deebo, they'd like to trade for him, or the 49ers could come to a realization that they might need to trade him in order to get a contract done with Brock Purdy. So that is all the news roundups that we have with the 49ers. Pretty significant names there to kind of keep an eye on and see how this 49ers team changes from now heading into next season, of course. But we got one more segment to get to on today's show, kind of a fun and exploratory sort of segment having to do with the Las Vegas Raiders head coaching position, right? I got two names here that I wanted to bring up to you guys, Bill Belichick and Deion Sanders. Kind of like a most likely scenario. Who's most likely to end up as the Raiders head coach next season, Bill Belichick or Deion Sanders? It sounds impossible, but I'm going to tell you guys why it might not be so unlikely based on what we've seen over the course of the last few days and really the last couple months. So I'll explain all of that when we return after this break. Thank you guys for joining me here for this last segment on today's show. And with all the head coaching talk and all the rumors and reported links to the Ben Johnsons of the world, the Aaron Glenns, and the Mike Vrabels, Las Vegas also just got rid of their head coach, Antonio Pierce. And Las Vegas is going to be super interesting to follow, I think, over this offseason and how and who gets that head coaching position over there with the Raiders, especially because we now know that Tom Brady is supposedly going to have a pretty big role in determining who that head coach is going to be. He's going to be a pretty loud voice in, the Raiders' ear to kind of sway them or influence who they get in as a head coach, right? That's the kind of benefit that you have with bringing him in as a minority owner for the team and part of the support team for owner Mark Davis. So, I don't have a problem with that. Some people might, but I think why not have the best quarterback of all time kind of give you some insight as to who to hire as your new head coach? I think that's a great idea. But already it was off to a pretty crazy start, honestly, because as soon as we heard, one report, one story about Tom Brady being involved with helping them find a new head coach, then we get this report from the NFL Network's Tom Pelissero, who reported that Tom Brady had actually been in contact with his former head coach, Bill Belichick, about any interest from Bill for this Raiders job, right? If there was any way, with Tom kind of reaching out to kind of gauge Bill Belichick's interest in returning to the NFL already without having even coached or even sniffed what it's like being a college head coach, right? Already we're getting these links back to the NFL, right? The irony in that. But that was a report from Tom Pelissero, and we got that obviously after Antonio Pierce was fired already this week, and right away there's these reports linking Bill Belichick to the head coaching job with the Las Vegas Raiders. And also, sources say that at least one other NFL team has reached out to Bill Belichick to kind of just check in and see if he has any interest in returning possibly. But the Athletic actually reported that Bill Belichick, as of right now, has no plans to return to the NFL, and they quoted that his sole focus is on coaching and recruiting as of right now. So, according to them, Bill Belichick is going to honor his commitment to the University of North Carolina. He isn't really thinking of really ditching them and going back to the NFL after it was kind of made a big deal where Bill Belichick was upset with the NFL and how nobody was kind of reaching out to him. So he decided, to say, forget you guys. I'm going to go to college and coach over here. And now, of course, now teams want him, right? It always ends up being the case. But, Bill Belichick did sign a 5-year deal at UNC. So it would be kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It would just be really rough, for a lack of a better term, on UNC to kind of hire Bill Belichick, be all excited about this, all the projections and predictions already for Bill next year in college football, just for him to go back to the NFL. I think that would be pretty harsh for UNC, but especially with this 5-year deal, it makes it a lot more, I guess, tricky to kind of just get out of it. But the biggest kind of caveat in all of it is the fact that there is a $10 million buyout clause in this contract if Bill Belichick decides to leave before June 1st. So that's kind of like the loophole in it all, right? That's the only way that Bill Belichick can just kind of say, you know what, I actually still want to be in the NFL. Sorry, UNC, I'm going to go back to the NFL. This $10 million buyout clause would have to be paid, and then Bill Belichick would just be pretty much be free to go join that NFL team, right? And you might think that that's not a big deal, but I think I heard J.J. Watt say something like recently about these links with Bill Belichick and returning to the NFL. He said something like, you don't have a clause in that contract unless you're not even remotely thinking about a way to kind of use it, right? I'm not saying that he's planning on using it, but you don't include anything like that unless there's not at least a 3% chance that it could end up being useful for you, right? If you really don't have the NFL in mind or anything like that, then don't include the clause at all, because you're not going to change your mind. But the fact that it's in there, there's a little bit maybe it could be there. Let's just have it there in case, right? I'm not looking at it, but just in case, right? That's kind of essentially what that is. So, the Athletic are saying that he's not really interested right now, and I think it's quite honestly pretty early to kind of get a gauge of how convincing the Raiders can be to try and pry Bill Belichick away from UNC. So that's one hypothetical, right? Then we get to the other one in Deion Sanders. And Deion Sanders has been linked to the NFL a good amount of times already through this, second portion of the season. And Deion Sanders actually appeared on Good Morning America, I think yesterday, if not a little bit before that, and he was asked about the possibility of coaching in the NFL and kind of like what it would take for him to make that move, right? Like what would have to happen. And Deion Sanders said, the only way I would consider is to coach my sons, not sons in the NFL. So pretty much saying that he would have, not that he would have to go to the NFL, but he would strongly consider going to the NFL if he had the opportunity to again coach both of his sons, Shiloh and Shedeur Sanders, like he did at Colorado. And it's interesting because before, when Deion was asked about it, he was all about Colorado. He was all about loving it there, wanting to stay there. And, I mean, to be fair, he is still saying that, but now I never heard anything before about him kind of being open to the possibility of coaching his sons, right? Before, it was mainly about Colorado, right? Like, his sons are moving on to the NFL. That's awesome. He's proud of them. But he never really, like, kind of gave an answer to that question, right? It was always just, I'm happy to be here in Colorado. Now, because of the question, we kind of got an insight as to what it would at least take for Deion to make the move over to the NFL. And isn't it interesting how that door has been opened just a little bit at the same time that Antonio Pierce was fired? And now today, we got news that the general manager for the Raiders, now former general manager for the Raiders, Tom Telesco, was actually fired today from the Raiders. The Raiders let him know of that today, and now the Raiders are looking for a new general manager and a new head coach. And also, coincidentally, the Raiders have the 6th pick in this year's draft. And if you want to talk about an opportunity to be in the running for Shedeur Sanders, I mean, the Raiders have a decent chance at it, at least more than they did for any quarterback last year, right? Because they were picking 13 last year. Now they're in the top 6. And there's a couple teams up there that maybe you could gauge their interest for a trade. And, I mean, depending what the Raiders' situation is with Deion and how much they want him to be their head coach, now we got this situation with Deion and Bill Belichick here in this most likely to scenario where I kind of laid out everything that has been played out, right? And to make a decision on what's most likely to happen based on the fact that the Raiders have fired Antonio Pierce, they just fired Tom Telesco, they don't really have too many interviews lined up as of yet. I mean, they have a couple with Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn, and Steve Spagnuolo, but, you know, that's pretty much it, and I'm sure that they're going to need a lot more than that. And where they are in the draft makes me kind of go to this place where these scenarios I don't think are so crazy, right? Because we have the $10 million clause for Bill Belichick in his contract already, his connections to Tom Brady, and also with Bill Belichick, there has been those reports, I guess you could say, how, you know, teams in the NFL didn't want to bring Bill Belichick on because they didn't want to give up that much control to Bill. And isn't it kind of funny now how the Raiders are in a position to hire not just a coach, but a general manager, 2 spots that Bill Belichick held in New England all those years, right? So if you couldn't already tell, I think out of these 2 guys to be the next coach of the Raiders, I think Bill Belichick is more likely to do it than Deion Sanders. Because Deion, you know, there's that appeal of the draft, and if the Raiders were to trade up with like the Giants or like the Cleveland Browns or something like that, right? If they were able to trade up and be up there, then it starts to get a little bit more serious for Deion Sanders, right? Because in that respect, you could go up, trade up, get Shedeur, and then realistically draft Shiloh in one of the later rounds, right? After the first round. So you could do something like that, but I think that's a lot of ifs and maybes to kind of happen. Right now, you're looking at this Raiders team that has the connection with Tom Brady, has all the willingness, I'm sure, to hand over all the power to Bill Belichick, right? You have the general manager position open, you have the head coaching position open, something that Bill Belichick is very accustomed to, and with an owner like Mark Davis, to me gives off the impression that he's just there to facilitate everything for the general manager and the head coach. He really gives a lot of trust to those guys, and I'm sure he wouldn't have any problem relinquishing that trust over to a guy like Bill Belichick. So in this scenario, I think actually Bill Belichick would be the most likely one to end up as the Raiders head coach, and that division would be something, right? If you had Bill Belichick, Sean Payton, Andy Reid, and Jim Harbaugh all competing for that division, would certainly be awesome to watch, and I would love to see that. But this process is definitely going to be one of the more longer, drawn-out ones, I'm guessing, because of these, hypothetical situations. I don't think it's so far out of the realm that they're just going to completely disregard it. I think there's a possibility where one of them are seriously in the running for that job. Not in January, not in February, maybe not even in early March. But as you go through this process, I think one of them is going to be seriously considered to be the head coach. I just don't know who yet, but I think it's going to be Bill Belichick, most likely, than Deion Sanders. But let me know what you guys think about that. That sort of hypothetical that I just threw out you guys. So with that being the case, that is everything we have for today's show. I want to thank you guys for joining me on today's episode, and a reminder to have you guys like, follow, and subscribe to the network as well as the Chip Shot Football Podcast, and follow the network on all forms of social media as well. And also, if you want to catch more of the Chip Shot Football Podcast, go on YouTube and check out the Sports Network channel and the GSMC Podcast Network channel, where there's more coverage around the NFL with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. There's more breaking news, reviews, previews, and just a bunch of discussion points on there for you guys to go and check out. But for right now, I'm signing off. I'll see you guys tomorrow back here again to close out the week and talk a little bit more of the upcoming playoff card that we have coming up this weekend.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the